Good day. Today is Saturday, 24th May 2025, and as I make this program, we are in a period between the meeting in Istanbul between the Russian and Ukrainian delegations and a possible future meeting at some undisclosed time between those delegations all over again, with the Russians saying that they are now close to completing their own memorandum, their own proposal of how the negotiations should be taken forward. There is no word at all of any similar preparations on the Ukrainian side. I'm starting to get the suspicion that the Ukrainians are making no effort to prepare any kind of counter document to whatever document the Russians may be working upon. They're waiting for the Russian document. They will declare the provisions of that document unacceptable, and I suspect that they will use that as grounds to walk away from the negotiations. That is my guess. Of course, I may be entirely wrong. If I am right, then one can expect a renewed attempt by the Ukrainians and their European allies, and perhaps Ukraine's allies in the US Senate, specifically Senator Lindsey Graham and his colleagues, as well as Ukraine's allies within the US administration, a renewed effort to try to get President Trump to agree to further sanctions against Russia, or more precisely, as I have discussed in previous videos, more sanctions against countries that trade with Russia, which is not quite the same thing as talking about sanctions that sanctions against Russia itself. Anyway, this is a little speculative, so let's wait and see. But I'm increasingly getting the sense that this is where all of this the negotiations are going. We will also see what the president himself, Donald Trump, decides to do. Now, I ought to say that, again, one continues to get the sense of an administration where there are different forces pulling in different directions. I notice that since the start of the process of negotiations, which basically began with President Putin's statement direct on the Saturday directly following the Victory Day parade, when he said that he would be sending a delegation to Istanbul to meet with the Ukrainians on the 15th of May, and Donald Trump's positive response to that initiative of President Putin's. Anyway, I noticed that since then, we have heard virtually nothing from General Kellogg. I mean, I have seen nothing further of him, and it may be that he has decided that, given that the president, in effect, went against his public statement, General Kellogg's public statement, that a ceasefire should precede negotiations, that General Kellogg, at least for the moment, has gone to ground. As I've discussed in other videos, we have seen the Marco Rubio talking constantly about sanctions against Russia, giving the impression that, on the one hand, that the president is not keen on the idea of sanctions, but also talking about sanctions in a way that might be seen as encouraging Lindsey Graham and his associates to move forward with sanctions. Anyway, so we do see those kind of moves from, if you like, the people within the administration who might be said to want a harder line against the Russians than President Trump seems to be interested in pursuing at the present time. But I'm going to suggest that over the last 24 hours, we've seen further signs of difference between Donald Trump and his immediate circle and other members of the administration. So, Donald Trump himself has written a Truth Social post welcoming the prisoner exchange between Russia and Ukraine, which was agreed in Istanbul on the 15th of May, and which is gradually proceeding. There are releases of prisoners by each side to the other. As I have said in previous programs, it seems as if the Ukrainians are having to fill out the number of prisoners that they exchange with the Russians by releasing civilian prisoners who are perhaps political dissidents. This having been agreed with the Russians because Ukraine has fewer prisoners to release to the Russians than the Russians have Ukrainian prisoners to release to Ukraine. This is what I have read. I can't verify it, but anyway, supposedly this is what is going on. Whether that is true or not, as I said, the prisoner exchange is proceeding, and Donald Trump has issued a very favourable Truth Social post commenting about this, seeing this as a first big step forward and hoping that it will lead to further progress in the negotiations going forward. And his vice president, J.D. Vance, has made a very, very interesting statement. He has said that the period of US military dominance is passing. He is saying that we are in the era again of great power competition. The United States no longer has that unchallenged military superiority over all other states that it had for a brief period, perhaps for about 2 decades after the end of the Cold War. That period is over. Today there is now a much greater, much clearer balance of military power between the three great powers. Now that's the sort of statement that J.D. Vance makes, and it's absolutely, by the way, a statement of truth. There's no question that it is true. And one gets the sense that the president himself, Donald Trump, shares that opinion. And Secretary of State Marco Rubio has sometimes talked in that way himself as well. But I also get the feeling that there are many people in Washington who do not like or want to accept that reality. And of course, there are many, many more people in Europe who also push back against it as well. So that's one side of the administration, Donald Trump and J.D. Vance. Trump welcoming the prisoner exchange, J.D. Vance confirming the military strategic realities. This side, I get the sense, overall does want to see the end, at least of American involvement in the war in Ukraine, and they've clearly signalled that to the Europeans, and they're not keen on pursuing a further economic war against Russia, deepening and escalating the economic war against Russia, especially if that means taking on third countries as well, like China and India, which are big buyers of Russian oil. So that's one side of the administration, but we see that there are others who appear to take different views. So there was a G7 meeting of finance ministers. Scott Bessent participated. Scott Bessent comes across to me as somebody who is much closer to the orthodoxies, if I can put it like that, of American foreign policy, at least the orthodoxies that have governed US policy throughout the post-Cold War period. And, well, Scott Bessent signed off to a statement, a joint statement by the G7, which spoke about Russia's brutal war against Ukraine and also appeared to threaten Russia with further sanctions if Russia didn't eventually agree to a ceasefire. It didn't speak of the kind of sanctions that Lindsey Graham is talking about, but certainly it did talk about sanctions, and the Europeans, for their part, seemed very relieved that this statement from the G7 was made. So we have this tension within the administration. Kellogg, as I said, for the moment has gone to ground, but Scott Bessent is active, Marco Rubio is active, and there do seem to be differences between this faction and Donald Trump and J.D. Vance and other people like them. And of course there is a third group, the US military. There's just been another statement. I haven't actually read it, but I am hearing about it, talking about how it is, I believe it's actually from the intelligence community, maybe from the CIA, that it is absolutely, saying it is absolutely essential that the United States catches up with and overtakes and surpasses China in technological war, and that this is an existential question for the United States. This report, as I said, I haven't read it, but it also appears to focus on China, sees China as the major adversary, which argues against diverting resources to contest Russia in Ukraine in the way that has been done for the last 3 years. So, as I said, we see these cracks and divisions within the administration. We can never be completely sure how this is going to go in the end. It could be that eventually there will be a showdown between Donald Trump and the Senate and the hardliners in the Senate, or it might turn out in all sorts of different ways that it's difficult for me from London to try to assess. To repeat again, especially within the House of Representatives, the Republican Party there, perhaps Speaker Johnson himself, seem much more attuned to the president's thinking than to that of people like Lindsey Graham in the Senate. So perhaps, possibly, we could see conflicts beginning to develop in those places. Meanwhile, the Europeans continue with their sanctions, and the Russians are saying that they've been hearing reports that the Europeans, having now agreed a completely ineffective 17th sanctions package, are now busy working on an 18th sanctions package, and that they are already discussing with each other a possible 19th sanctions package beyond the further 18th package, which is already being spoken about. The Russians are quite clear that the primary objective at the moment of the Europeans is to try to stop Russian oil exports from passing through the Baltic Sea. And the Russian expectation, as reported in the Russian media, I think it was Izvestia, is that the initial step that the Europeans are going to take is that they're going to forbid EU-chartered vessels from shipping Russian oil. And the idea is that because the oil price has recently fallen, that means that the Russians prefer to use EU-chartered tankers to tankers from other countries, because using EU-chartered tankers is cheaper. And with the oil at the moment, the price of oil at the moment being actually below the G7 oil price cap, so, which is $60, which means that it makes economic and financial sense for the Russians to use EU-chartered tankers to ship oil. So the idea is, apparently, to prevent that, to try to block Russian oil exports that way. Of course, it won't block Russian oil exports. They can still use non-EU tankers to ship oil, but there will be an extra cost, and that will impact to some minor extent on Russian oil receipts. Again, I think that the significance of this as an economic measure can be exaggerated. But beyond that, and as I've discussed in various other programs, it does look as if there is growing talk and discussion now about eventually implementing some kind of NATO blockade of Russian shipping from Russia's Baltic ports, presumably mostly St. Petersburg, where of course I have just been. And as I discussed in a recent program, the Russians are already talking about establishing convoys for their tankers, for their shipping, traveling through the Baltic, protected by the Russian fleet. And of course, the Russian Air Force is in a position also to operate over the Baltic Sea as well. So the stage, or so the Russians believe, is being set for some kind of confrontation in the Baltic. An wild and disastrous idea, if I may say, an incredibly reckless one. And I wonder whether the people who are thinking about this idea, if they really are thinking about this idea in Europe, which I think likely, by the way, whether again they've thought through the full implications of it. And I wonder how European publics will react. And I wonder how the Trump people in Washington will react if they're faced with a situation where their European allies are drifting into a direct military confrontation with the Russians in the Baltic Sea without perhaps the President of the United States having been consulted and informed about it in advance. Anyway, that's, it seems to me, where we are at the moment. Now, here I would like to say a few further things about St. Petersburg, where of course I have been. It looks increasingly as if St. Petersburg might be almost a frontline city in these kind of confrontations. As I said, it is Russia's biggest city on the Baltic. So presumably, if we are seeing these sort of confrontations begin to develop, St. Petersburg will be on the front line. Well, I have just been to St. Petersburg, and I saw no evidence of anything like this at all. I didn't see large numbers of military people deployed in the city itself. I saw no sign of enhanced security. The police presence was light to the point of almost complete invisibility. There were certainly no restrictions placed on me as a Westerner travelling in St. Petersburg, though it's worth saying that I was obviously accompanied by a Russian official who, however, was entirely helpful and was there to facilitate my movements through St. Petersburg, and who, as far as I could see, was in no way I can definitely say was in no way seeking to restrict my movements, though it was he who suggested the various itineraries that we would follow. But anyway, I saw no sign of any kind of military stress of that kind in St. Petersburg at the present time. The city came across to me as both safe and, for the moment, entirely at peace, with no sign of any looming military confrontation anywhere on the horizon. Now, I would just add at this point a few further things, though, which is that in my previous program, I mentioned that I saw no signs of economic distress in St. Petersburg at all. No black market speculators or dealers, no people coming along and sidling up to you. And I wasn't, I should say, always accompanied, but there was one moment when I was not in the company of this person that I mentioned. Nobody at any time approached me offering anything to me in an undercut way. There was absolutely none of the signs of that I saw of economic distress or economic stress in the city itself. It looked, as I said, relaxed and entirely at peace and significantly more affluent than it was when I last saw it, which was way back in 2016. However, I have been informed that a visitor who attended the legal forum alongside myself and the official who accompanied him went on a shopping expedition, as I also did, by the way, in St. Petersburg, and visited a shopping complex, a very old shopping complex called Gostiny Dvor, just on Nevsky Prospect, which was built, by the way, in the 18th century and is a very, very impressive building in its own right. But anyway, put that aside. Anyway, they visited Gostiny Dvor, and they did see there shops which had clearly closed down and that were no longer trading. Now, I never saw anything like that anywhere in St. Petersburg myself, but I'm not traveling. I haven't obviously been able to go to every single part of the city. I didn't see these closed down shops in the Gostiny Dvor myself. There could be any number of reasons why those shops closed. After all, trade does take place, shops do open, and they do close. But maybe this was some indicator that some of the economic pressures, the high interest rates, the high inflation that we have seen over the last couple of months have had an effect on some businesses. So, in full completeness, I think it is only proper for me to mention this fact. Nonetheless, and overall, as I said, I stick with my general view. A city relaxed and at peace. If we are looking at a confrontation, a military confrontation of some kind on the horizon or in the Baltic, with Russian merchant ships traveling through the Baltic, escorted by the Russian Navy and facing off possible challenges from NATO warships attempting to seize Russian merchant ships on the high seas, specifically in the Baltic itself. Well, if that kind of confrontation is looming, then, as I said, in St. Petersburg, I got no hint of it and no sign that anybody would expect it. Anybody there was expecting it? I will just add one very last point to all of this, which is that I did say in my previous discussion that obviously the only city that I have visited in Russia, and only for a brief time, is St. Petersburg. I cannot be certain about the general mood or situation across this gigantic country, and perhaps it might be unwise to jump to any definite conclusions based on impressions obtained in just a few hours in one of the two major cities of Russia. But it has been pointed out to me that St. Petersburg is a port city. It is perhaps Russia's major city closest to the West. When Peter the Great built it, people spoke about it as being Russia's window on the West. Perhaps if there really were economic pressures, if the sanctions really were having a major effect on Russia, the city where they would be most visible would be St. Petersburg. I just mentioned this. It's an interesting thought. If true, then let me repeat again. I didn't myself see any stresses from the sanctions whilst I was in St. Petersburg, though I have had this report now about the closed shops in the Gostiny Dvor. Anyway, there we are. So we are in this strange limbo period between the talks that took place on the 15th of May, a possible resumption of talks at some location, somewhere, on some date, at some time. The Russians have told us that they're working on their memorandum, so there's no reason to think that it will be in any way different from what the Russians have already been saying about the way they want the war to end, basically Istanbul plus, and no word at all about any of this from the Ukrainians. They're still harping on about the ceasefire that they insist must be imposed first, and I'm not convinced that they're actually working on any sort of memorandum at all. Maybe they will put a memorandum together, but quite plausibly it will simply be a repetition of the peace plan that, ceasefire plan that was outlined in Paris by the Europeans and the Ukrainians 3 or 4 weeks ago, which, as I've said, I've discussed previously, and which was essentially a demand that Russia basically lay down its arms in advance of its future capitulation. I discussed the European Ukrainian plan in a video shortly after that plan appeared. So it could very well be that that is all that the Ukrainians will say in a short document, or maybe they won't prepare or provide a memorandum of their own at all. One thing I would add is that Sergei Lavrov has apparently made clear that, contrary to my own initial understanding of what Trump and Putin agreed with each other in the last conversation they had, that the Russians are not going to set out a specific timeline in this memorandum. So it looks as if Trump thought that would happen, that's not what the Russians are thinking. And, for the moment, perhaps it really doesn't matter one way or the other, because whatever is in the Russian memorandum, it looks as if the Ukrainians are intending to reject it and to say that it isn't taking things further at all. Now, I said that General Kellogg is currently silent, that he's not, in effect, saying anything. But one person who is very busy talking about the whole future direction of the war, and who's proving to be very critical of the conduct of the discussions by Donald Trump, is the US's former ambassador to Ukraine, Ms. Brink, who I remember was described recently as a protege of Victoria Nuland. And she's been making all the same predictable points that we hear about Russian aggression, about how concessions to Russia would embolden China, about how there must be no concessions to Russia at all, about how the administration should be seeking a ceasefire and not go beyond that. The idea proposed by Mr. West Mitchell, whom I've discussed many times in many programs, in a recent article in Foreign Affairs, and of course the idea that General Kellogg has run with, that the idea of negotiations without a ceasefire is unacceptable, that there must be a ceasefire first and negotiations only after. And, well, as I said, I suspect that we'll be hearing an awful lot more of that over the next couple of weeks and months. And it's very interesting that Ms. Brink has clearly become, as far as I can see, Ukraine's advocate and lobbyist in the United States, as opposed to her presumed previous role, which is to be the ambassador of the United States to Ukraine. That often happens, by the way, that the ambassador to a country, especially the American ambassador to the country, especially if that country is an ally of the United States, converts very quickly to become the lobbyist for that country in the very complicated political system which exists in Washington. Anyway, there we go. She's another voice, and we will no doubt be seeing a lot more of her. She'll be turning up, no doubt, in the various talk shows in Washington, and we'll be no doubt hearing a great deal of what she has to say. Ms. Brink's comments and statements might be explaining something else which is now going on, which is that following the sacking of Mike Waltz, Donald Trump's national security advisor, there is said to be a purge underway of staff at the National Security Council. There was a previous purge just after the president was inaugurated, but it seems as if there is now a renewed purge going on. The National Security Council, as well as the State Department, were heavily populated by neocons, and probably at some point we're going to be seeing all of these purged officials from the National Security Council joining people like Ms. Brink and making the same talking points on the various talk shows and chat shows, lobbying for Ukraine. So just prepare yourself for that. All of these so-called experts are going to start surfacing, trying to shape the narrative, trying to shape our views of the conflict in the next few weeks. Does all of this matter? The Russians, as I said in a program that I did some time ago, about a week ago, give me the impression that they are mostly focused on the war. Undoubtedly, President Putin is taking his dealings with Donald Trump very seriously. He spoke, as I said, to Donald Trump for 2 hours. It's likely that both presidents, Trump and Putin, do want to meet with each other, though for the moment there's no further word of that meeting being arranged. The Russians, as I said, are working on the memorandum that Putin said to Trump that they would prepare. So it could be, all of that is going on, but it does nonetheless seem to me that the major energy, the major focus on the part of the Russians continues to be winning the war. It is the battle. It is the actual fighting that probably occupies the minds of the major policymakers in Moscow, in the Kremlin, in the various ministries, in the General Staff, and of course in the Security Council. And every day we get more news of further fighting happening across Ukraine. So a couple of days ago, I think it was yesterday in fact, the Russian Defense Ministry claimed that a village called, I believe, Radlokub, which is located just north of Kupiansk, has now been captured by the Russian military. Entirely predictably, the Ukrainians are denying this. They're saying that they still control the village, and some neutral mappers are agreeing with them. I am not there. I do not know one way or the other, but the Russians say that they have captured this village. And of course, if they have captured this village, some say that they're just a few hundred meters away from Kupiansk. Others say that it's a little bit more than that. Who knows? But anyway, there's been the capture of that particular village, or not, as the case may be. There are reports, by the way, that the Ukrainians have made an attempt to recapture the village of Torske, west of Siversk. Again, there's no confirmation of this. There's been no pictures or photos so far showing the Ukrainians having recaptured Torske. It's all based upon one film which shows the Russians bombing Ukrainian positions on the very western outskirts of Torske, which could be a sign of the Russians repelling a Ukrainian counterattack. Just saying. But anyway, there's fighting continuing to take place in these places. There's also lots of talk about the Russians gaining much more ground around Konstantinovka. Our old friend Andrei Marochko says that the Russians are now 7 kilometers distant from the major Ukrainian positions in Konstantinovka, and that he appears to expect that an attack will take place on Konstantinovka very soon. There is more reports of the Russians having completed the capture of Malinivka, village to the northeast of Mirnograd and Pokrovsk, and of the Russians having closed in and begun the first probing attacks on the key village. In fact, it's a small town known as Novoekonomichny, northeast of Pokrovsk. If you look at where Novoekonomichny actually is, you can see why the fall of this place would be absolutely critical to the defense of Pokrovsk. And I can well imagine that once this place is captured, Ukrainian defenses in Pokrovsk could very, very quickly unravel. Resupplying Pokrovsk in the event of the fall of this village would be, I think, extremely difficult. But anyway, so heavy battles clearly taking place there. And further to the southwest of Pokrovsk, the Russians not only seem to have crossed into Dnipro region in one place, but they're now poised to enter Dnipro region at multiple places. They've been continuing their advances towards the Dnieper, and it remains my view that, especially after Pokrovsk falls, this is going to remain still the major place, where the weight of the Russian offensive is going to fall. There will certainly be attempts to capture Slavyansk-Kramatorsk and that particular conurbation. In fact, that's clearly going to come. But as I said, the major weight of the Russian advance, I suspect, is going to be towards the Dnieper, because this is the heartland of Ukraine. If the Russians reach the center of Ukraine in the Dnieper, if they reach Zaporozhye and Dnipro, well, I'm not saying it's game over, but it will be an existential crisis for Ukraine, and one which Ukraine might struggle to overcome. Now, all of this is going on the battlefields. There's increasing talk now, you can find it all over the media, about a continued Russian buildup of a major offensive being prepared. There's talk, by the way, there's more pictures which have just appeared of major Russian training grounds and fortified positions in the Baltic area close to Finland, the border with Finland. It seems that there are not actually that many troops located there. That, in fact, and despite earlier reports, the weight of the Russian forces continues to be concentrated on Ukraine. So the enormous buildup that we have been hearing about, which is taking place, not just the two reserve armies, but the various other reserve armies that the Russians are also gradually creating, they don't actually seem to be positioned, contrary to some reports, in these bases that are being built in the Baltic area, which is interesting. But the point is that these armies do exist. They have been trained or are being trained up. The two key reserve armies, as I said, have been in the process of building for about 2.5 years now. They're made up of veterans, combat veterans, and they're officered by experienced officers. So once they're unleashed, they are in a strong position to begin a major offensive. And this is what I'm now going to discuss, because over the last couple of days, there's been a gradual shift in the narrative, which I've noticed, about the state of the Ukrainian military. First of all, I'm going to go back to what General Zaluzhny, Ukraine's ambassador to London, former military commander of the Ukrainian armed forces, rival of President Zelensky's. He's in effect in exile now in London, what he had to say. And it was very interesting. And to some extent, I think I was unjust to him in my comments, in the comments about him which I made in my program yesterday, when I said that I thought that he was beginning to become somewhat out of touch. On the contrary, if you actually look at his statements carefully, if you analyze them carefully, you begin to see that far from being optimistic about Ukraine's prospects in the war, though he is very, very careful to give positive spin on events, may be aware of the fact that if he speaks too openly and too critically, he risks falling foul of Zelensky. Anyway, if you actually analyze what Zaluzhny had to say, he is clearly very concerned about the overall situation. He said that the Ukrainian military is very short of manpower. That has been confirmed, interestingly enough, in an article by the British columnist Timothy Garton Ash, a fervid supporter of Ukraine, somebody whose fervour on behalf of Ukraine it would be difficult to overstate, it'd be impossible actually to overstate. He has just been to Ukraine. He's been given the same story about how Ukraine is holding its own, and how the drone wall is enabling Ukraine to hold the Russians back. I'll come to that shortly. Anyway, but in this article, Timothy Garton Ash lets slip the fact that the Ukrainian army is now very short of men, that there are positions which are not actually no longer defended by any men at all, that there are actual gaps, growing gaps of personnel across the Ukrainian lines, that in fact these positions are entirely defended by drones. And though he says that, there are at the moment, no shortages of equipment. There are critical shortages of manpower right across the front lines. And as I said, in some places, units are down to 30% of strength. And in other places, as I said, there are actually no people actually manning the trenches at all. So this is what Zaluzhny is also saying. Zaluzhny is very, very much less confident about the equipment situation. He seems to consider that Ukraine is also running short of equipment too. And of course, there's been reports that in fact, Ukraine has been running through very fast the equipment provided by the Biden administration in its last weeks. And there are some claims that that equipment, the shells and the equipment that the Biden administration in its last weeks supplied to Ukraine, that it will start to run out next month. I've heard various time frames for this, and I'm not going to speculate. But anyway, Zaluzhny, not so confident about the equipment situation, but also talking about the fact, the same as Timothy Gartnash, that the Ukrainian army is short, is becoming increasingly short of men. And Zaluzhny also did say that the only way that Ukraine can hold back the Russians is if it turns to high-tech drone defenses. But he seemed to think, he basically said that even in this area, Ukraine is falling short, and that the Russians, in fact, are starting to draw ahead. So he said that Ukraine still might be able to hold its own against the Russians if it properly embraces and conducts high-tech warfare using drones. And that possibility exists. But he seemed to think that it is not actually fully in that position at the present time. Now, all this is very interesting because over the last couple of days, about the last week, we're starting to get the first admissions that it is indeed the Russians who are drawing ahead and increasingly fast ahead in the drone war. There's been, for example, an article about this in the London Times, very interesting article, how Putin's new drone war is getting deadlier. Kamikaze drones that can defy jamming are killing soldiers and destroying convoys ever further from the front line. And this article by Anthony Lloyd appeared on the 23rd of May. And we're told about how, well, there's the usual vivid descriptions of how people have been attacked by drones. And we're told that 9 kilometers is now an easy range in which to die. Shrugged a Ukrainian lieutenant, Stanislav, from the 93rd Mechanized Brigade in the Konstantinovka area. So 9 kilometers behind the front lines is now becoming a particularly dangerous point. He says that no other vehicle, weapon type has changed the face of war here so much or so fast as the MPV drone. Any vehicle within 5 kilometers of the front is as good as finished. Anything moving out to 10 kilometers is in danger. Drone strikes at 15 to 20 kilometers behind the front line are not that unusual. Russia has taken the lead in the drone race, outproducing Kiev in the manufacture and use of medium-range FPV drones at fiber optic variants that have changed the shape of the entire 1,200-kilometer front line. Often impervious to jamming, the new generation of mass-produced, medium-ranged Russian FPV drones, such as the Molniya 1, and their fiber optic FPV equivalents, are not only killing Ukrainian soldiers and civilians far from the front, but altering the physical makeup of the front line, the tactics of the war, and the psychology of the soldiers fighting it. They are also having a devastating impact on Ukraine's logistical ability. And then we're told that because of the drones, the effect of the Russian drones, which are constant over the battlefields, it means that Ukrainian soldiers on the front lines are under constant stress and have to adapt themselves continuously to changing situations. And most critically, it has affected the ability to rotate and deploy soldiers, because as the Ukrainians cannot move troops to the front line on vehicles, on armored vehicles or soft-skinned vehicles, they have to basically gradually infiltrate themselves by foot to reach the front line. It's dangerous for them to do so. It's dangerous for them to retreat, for rotations, to be withdrawn from rotations. And that means that soldiers, putting aside the fact that there are often no replacements for them, are having to stay on the front lines for inordinately long periods with sporadic replacements and with increasingly difficult supplies. Now, I've discussed this many times, and I said that there is a difference to the way in which the two sides use drones. The Ukrainians use their combat drones to try to, as far as I can tell, mostly in order to attack Russian positions on the front lines and to repel Russian advances. Whereas the Russians have centered their use of drones on cutting off supplies to the Ukrainian front lines. And the Russians have far more drones. They are producing them industrially. They're starting to flood the skies with drones. Their drones are much less affected by jamming. And this article in the London Times sets out the effects. Now, this article has appeared at roughly the same time as an article has appeared in the British magazine Unheard, and it is about inside a secret Ukrainian drone factory. It was published by Ian Birrell on the 21st of May, and it describes what he refers to, what Ian Birrell calls a Ukrainian drone factory in some undisclosed location in Ukraine, though it appears to be Kiev, or at least an area close to Kiev, where drones are made. And he describes a clandestine, white-walled workshop cluttered with shelves of tools, boxes of machine parts, and spools of wire. And he speaks of a handful of men in their 20s and 30s making some of the most sophisticated military drones on Earth. So what he is describing, and there's even a photograph of the inside of the workshop with one of the workmen. What he is describing is not a factory, as far as I can tell, but a workshop. And no doubt there are many, many of these workshops across Ukraine. But to repeat again, this is a fragmented industry trying to produce drones in numbers to keep up with what the Russians are doing industrially in large factories. Now, I have been talking about this for many months now. Initially, at least, artisanal production can be very effective and can produce drones, equipment, in significant numbers. But as somebody who has had experience of industrial processes, I can absolutely definitely say that this type of production simply cannot match what is produced in large factories in an organized way on organized industrial production lines. Sooner or later, the factory system is going to swamp the workshop system. And that, judging by that article in the London Times and by various other articles which I have also been reading, is precisely what we are now seeing. Now, I'm going to also push back, by the way, on a claim that it is the Ukrainians. It was the Ukrainians who had the advantage, who pioneered the use of battlefield drones. They might have been more advanced at the outset in the use of FPV drones than the Russians were. This is back in 2022. But again, if we are talking about 2022, 2023, the Russians always appear to have been ahead of the Ukrainians in reconnaissance drones, like the ubiquitous Orlan drones, which are operating and have been operating constantly across the battlefields. And it was the Russians who pioneered kamikaze drones and started to use them most effectively on the battlefields, specifically the Lancet drones that the Russians used to deadly effect in repelling the Ukrainian summer offensive of 2023. There is a huge amount of narrative built around this question of drones. It has confused many, many people. The Ukrainians are able to produce drones themselves from various parts. They can establish, as I said, artisanal workshops that can do this. They're not dependent on big factories as you have to be. You can't produce tanks or aircraft or, by the way, artillery shells in this way. You can produce drones in dispersed warehouses. But even then, you can't compete in drone warfare with a major industrial producer, which is what the Russians are. And over the next couple of weeks, I predict that we're going to see the advantage sway even further in favor of the Russians in drone warfare, as in very, very much else. The Russians are going to be able to put out more and more drones, and the Ukrainians perhaps will also increase their production, at least to some extent, but they will not be able to compete with the Russians in this area. And I'm going to say that there are also mistakes that the Ukrainians are making, because though Ukrainian successes in drone warfare are overwhelmingly with their tactical drones, for reasons of morale and prestige and all that, they continue to waste resources by launching drone strikes with large numbers of drones on targets inside Russia itself. Now, according to the Russian Defense Ministry, over the last couple of days, Ukraine has launched around 1,000 drones against targets in Russia. Some of those drones have been targeting Moscow. And it is impossible for me to see what benefit Ukraine is gaining from this. perhaps every so often a drone gets through and does some damage. But given the sheer scale of Moscow, of the Russian industrial system, and given the effectiveness of the Russian air defense system, which is uncontested, whereas Ukraine's air defenses, for example, are themselves subject to constant, continuous attack by Russian missiles. There's just been pictures released, film released by the Russian Defense Ministry of a successful destruction by the Russians of a Patriot missile battery in Dnipro region, which was exposed to a Russian missile strike using an Iskander missile. Well, there is no part of the Russian air defense system across Russia is vulnerable to this kind of attack. There's no ability for Ukraine to launch strikes on Russian air defenses, heavy air defenses, say in the Moscow region. So it seems as if the Russian air defenses are now able to shoot down the vast majority of these Ukrainian drones that are launched against Russia. And from what I can tell, if and when Ukrainian drones do sometimes get through, the damage they do, despite claims in Ukraine to the contrary, are superficial. Now, here people will say, well, a single cheap drone that manages to hit a Russian oil refinery or some other facility will do more damage than it costs. But this is to look at this thing from a wrong perspective, because the question is not whether the cost of the Ukrainian drone is less than the cost of whatever target it manages to get through and damage and destroy. It is whether Ukraine is devoting too much, a disproportionate part of its very limited resources to this kind of strategic offensive against Russian targets, which are having minimal effect on the Russian economy and the Russian war effort. Or not. And I would say they are, because if you are conducting a drone war based on essentially warehouses and workshops and things of that kind, as opposed to factories, then you are diverting skilled workers and equipment to building small numbers, making large numbers of strategic drones, which you're sending against Moscow, and you're committing some of your best drone operators and some of your best information systems to strikes deep inside Russia, which are achieving nothing. Whereas you could more usefully use those resources in countering the Russian military on the actual battlefronts. Here again, we have another example of the way in which Ukraine is devoting too much time and effort to winning public relations battles, which is what these offensives, these drone offensives against Russia actually are, as against real actions that might potentially make some difference on the battlefronts. Now, I say all of this. There will be some people who will say, well, all that I've just said, the Ukrainians might hear it and they might run away and decide that they could work with all of that and change their strategies. But of course they won't, because they never do. Zelensky, Syrskyi, Podolyak, Yermak, all of these people, they remain obsessed with fighting a PR war in order to try to persuade people like Timothy Garton Ash and others who write in the Western media, and people like Lindsey Graham and those sort of people, that Ukraine is actually dealing some real blows against the Russians, when of course it is not. You see this all the time and in every place. The Ukrainians continue, even as I'm making this program, they are continuing in their utterly pointless attempts to capture the village of Totkino in Kursk region. They have been sending attack after attack against this village for, well, weeks now, ever since they were pushed out of Kursk region. There's some reports that they managed to capture a few buildings in Totkino. They've suffered disproportionate losses doing this. There's some claims that this is all being done in order to prevent the Russian army from conducting its own offensive in Sumy region and creating the buffer zone that Vladimir Putin was talking about, and which I discussed in my program yesterday. That makes absolutely no sense to me. How are you preventing the Russian army from establishing a buffer zone by throwing away men and machines to capture a single village in Kursk region? You're simply weakening forces and throwing away valuable men and machines which could be used more effectively to defend against the Russian offensive when it comes. But again, Zelensky, Syrskyi, Yermak, Podolyak, all of them focused on trying to regain some few 100 meters, a few blown up houses in Kursk region, so that Ukraine can continue to claim that it has some kind of presence on Russian territory. Now, all of this is going to catch up on Ukraine. In fact, it is already doing so. It has already caused Ukraine significant losses. Alex Vershinin, US military officer who writes for RUSI, the Royal United Services Institute, in his recent report, pointed this out. But at this stage of the war, continuing with these practices, which have never made any real sense, is becoming increasingly self-defeating. In fact, it is becoming, frankly, downright bizarre. Well, I've spent a lot of time talking about drones because, as I said, it gets an awful lot of attention. But to repeat again, the Russians have a massive advantage in artillery. It's likely that there's production of artillery from North Korean factories. In fact, there is production of artillery shells in North Korean factories. I've been provided with a whole explanation and account of how it is being done, of how one particular factory in North Korea has been refurbished with Russian under Russian supervision, how shells are being produced there, how old North Korean shells are being refurbished, how the Russians are providing explosives for these shells, how the Russians have set up new explosives factories right across Russia, which are providing explosives to Russian shell armaments factories and munitions factories, and also to this factory in North Korea, how shell production in Russia continues to grow and how it is being supplemented by shell production in North Korea. The Russians are producing more tanks, more armored vehicles. They're training more troops all the time. Their soldiers are becoming more and more experienced. I've seen a report, an actual film, of a drone operator who speaks of a Russian drone operator, except he's not Russian. He's actually American, but he's now working for the Russians. And he describes how the mood amongst the Russian soldiers is becoming increasingly confident, how Russian soldiers, unlike Ukrainian soldiers, are continuously rotated. Russian air defences much more advanced on the front lines, which makes it much easier for the Russians to rotate their soldiers than it is for the Ukrainians, as the London Times article explained. How the Russians are being equipped with new weaponry all the time, and how these big reserve armies are growing every day in scale and size. And all of this, as I said, even as the Russian advances on the front line continue, and even as the Ukrainians continue to take further and further losses. Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis has written an article for the publication 1945, in which he has recently made the point that anybody who thinks that the Ukrainian army can continue to accept the damage that it is facing day after day, indefinitely, and continue fighting and somehow get through this war minus a peace settlement is simply not keeping track of what is actually happening. And I have to say, based on everything I've seen, that is absolutely right. Major Reisner of the Austrian army has also come out and made the point that attrition wars, it's a point I've made many times, end suddenly for many months, sometimes years. The front lines appear to move very, very slowly, because that is the nature of attrition war, where the objective is to destroy the enemy, to destroy his army, to destroy his logistics system, to undermine his economy. And by the way, Zaluzhny actually spoke about the way in which the Ukrainian economy is also under intense, extreme pressure, dependent as it has become entirely on Western funding, which might very well be reduced. But when the breaking point is reached, as we saw in many wars which have been attrition wars, Vershinin actually ticked off some of them. The Spanish Civil War, the First World War, other wars, when the moment when it all starts to break comes, the collapse comes quickly. And then movements become very, very fast. Now, again, I'm not going to predict where we are. But when even people like Timothy Garton Ash are talking about how short Ukraine is of manpower, how trenches are being left empty, how Ukraine is depending on drones, and as we see, the balance of advantage in the war is shifting decisively to the Russians in drones, in terms of drones. And drones, anyway, as I said, are not the only weapon or even the most important one. Well, we can see how the balance, we're getting closer and closer to that breaking point with every day that passes. And even as the Ukrainians continue their massive but ineffectual drone strikes against Russia, the Russians continue their missile and drone strikes on Ukraine. We're told that the Russians will soon be able to launch 500 Geran drones against Ukraine every night. That's the Ukrainians themselves saying it. Last night, the Russians launched major missile and drone strikes across Ukrainian targets right across Ukraine. Once again, Kiev appears to have been the major area of concentration of Russian strikes. And one facility that appears to have been particularly damaged was the Antonov factory, a Soviet-era factory which used to make some of the most advanced and powerful transport aircraft ever produced. I understand it barely functions as an aircraft factory anymore, but no doubt it does other things. Anyway, it was particularly badly hit. And again, as has been true now for a long time, it looks as if Ukrainian air defenses are becoming increasingly fragmented, even in Kiev itself. Ukrainians continuing to beg for more Patriot missiles. There's reluctance on the part of some European and other allies to provide Ukraine with Patriot missiles. Patriot missiles themselves in short supply in the West. And, well, I talked about the destruction of a Patriot missile battery by an Iskander missile in Dnipro. The Russians, anyway, are able to destroy these missiles. This cannot go on indefinitely. I think Donald Trump, J.D. Vance, some people in the Pentagon understand this. It seems that some people in the West do not. I wonder how much longer things will continue this way. Anyway, this perhaps continues to be where the war is going to be determined, on the battlefronts. Because, to be frank, as I said, I still don't get the sense that Ukraine is really serious about negotiations. They still cling to the belief that the West is going to ride to their rescue, that the British and the French troops will come, that the Americans will follow, that they will take on the Russian Air Force and sweep the skies clean of the Russian missiles and fighters. They close their eyes to the fact that the US Air Force has not been able to defeat the Houthis in Yemen. But apparently they believe that it can defeat the Russians in Ukraine. Well, there we go. For so long as people cling to these illusions and tell them to each other and give each other reassurances, this war will go on with all of the results we have seen. Well, this is where I'm going to finish today's program. There'll be more from me soon. I'm going to talk about the situation in the Middle East, probably a bit more in my next program. Let me just say, in the meantime, that I'm actually, as I complete this program, preparing to travel to the country, to the English countryside. It's my children's holidays, and we're going to the country, but I still intend to do videos whilst we are there, but I'll be somewhere else. You won't be seeing me in my library for at least another week. Anyway, in the meantime, let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop. Links under this video. Last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.